Why hello my fellow apes, I hope you are well. Welcome back to our series tackling Dennis Prager's Master's PhD Professor program, whose thesis is, in Dennis's words,
if society gets too secular, it ends. That's right, it ends.
In the first instalment, we introduced Dennis, the thesis of his master's program, defined key terms, and emphasised some of his rhetoric. He ensured us that he has no axe to grind, only to immediately follow this up by telling us that he has an axe to grind.
I have no axe to grind here. My axe to grind is what is true.
Oh, hold up. No, I get it now. If someone is in possession of the truth, then they don't actually have an axe to grind. They're completely neutral and objective, or they have a completely different type of axe to grind. Got it. So, in other words, absolutely everyone is unarmed.
I have no axe to grind here.
In the second installment, we were unexpectedly caught off guard by the Spanish Inquisition.
The Spanish Inquisition.
And we were especially caught off guard when Dennis dismissed the Spanish Inquisition and the Crusades as if they are pretty much nothing.
That's not exactly what we call genocide.
Then we acknowledged Dennis's claim that the greatest genocides in the 20th century were committed in the 20th century.
The greatest genocides of the 20th century occurred in the 20th century.
And then, finally, we addressed his claim that these atrocities were caused specifically by secularism. You know, the principle of separation of religious institutions from state institutions.
And this is all a function of the secular world in which we live.
Today, though, we're going to tackle Dennis's bread and butter, his insistence that without the God of the Bible minus Islam,
the God of the Bible, the Judeo-Christian God,
there is no objective morality.
My point is that if there is no God who says do not steal or do not murder, stealing and murder are not wrong.
We'll soon change your mind about that.
As has been demonstrated in prior episodes, Dennis consistently conflates and confuses secularism with all other isms or indeed non-isms that he believes are bad, such as science. Yes, science.
Now it's secular religion. Feminism, science, Marxism, socialism, communism, environmentalism. These are isms. They are like a religious doctrine.
This alone exposes that Dennis either hasn't taken the time to possess even a rudimentary understanding of secularism, or indeed that he understands it just fine, but is willfully deceiving his audience.
That's not exactly
a good look in either case. Not surprisingly, then, he does precisely the same with morality. Moral elements he likes are God-given, whereas moral elements he doesn't like are evil, secular, college establishment, leftist, and what have you. Basically a load of buzzwords. I'll give you a quick example before we move into the thick of it. Here's Dennis claiming that human worth is dependent on the existence of specifically his God.
There's an irony about secular humanism. It doesn't do much to value the human. The Judeo-Christian world gave us the biblical notion that we are created in God's image. That means every single person is of infinite preciousness. The human being is infinitely precious. This is dying in the post-Christian world in which we live.
Notice, first of all, the irony of Dennis claiming that secularism doesn't value the human, all while showing pictures of humans protesting to encourage the preservation of the one and only planet we humans have.
This is dying in the post-Christian world in which we live.
You see, caring for the human is, to Dennis, upholding traditions that are extremely anti-human, anti-egalitarian. You know, opposing equality between the sexes, promoting intolerance and hate towards anyone who doesn't fit very narrow dimensions, and stifling scientific advancements that would benefit all. To run with the example that Dennis depicted, climate change activism is about ensuring that the generations of humans that follow us actually have a world worth inheriting, and, of course, it has nothing to do with secularism. There are people who are in favour of a secular state that couldn't care less for climate change, and there are people who are in favour of a theocratic state who care a great deal for climate change, considering it our duty, no less, to take care of the gift of this planet, just as Adam was instructed to take care of the animals in the Garden of Eden. This is also true of sexual, racial, and gender movements. The movements that Dennis consistently treats as if they're detrimental to valuing humans, that they're corrosive to society. These movements are egalitarian to the core. Valuing humans, all humans, are their substrate. Their baseline is that it doesn't matter what vagina you fall out of. No matter your sex, gender, or the melanin in your skin, you are valued. You deserve an equal opportunity. Secondly, let's take a look at Dennis's logic. He concludes from the proposition,
We are created in God's image.
that we therefore have infinite preciousness.
That means every single person is of infinite preciousness. The human being is infinitely precious.
Dennis doesn't explain how he gets to this conclusion, nor how he's defining preciousness. I know, what a shock. So we'll move on. Springboarding from the notion that secularists don't value humans, and more specifically that we don't think we're created in God's image, Dennis concludes that we are no more valuable than a pebble or an animal. Yes, of course, humans are animals, and there are plenty of people who are in favour of a secular state who also believe that we are created in the image of God. Dennis has made this quite a mess, but we've got to forego these inconsistencies to meet him where he's at. And where he's at is, well...
PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. Biggest animal rights group in America. Raises many millions of dollars a year. There is a program they have for years called Holocaust on Your Plate. Look it up. And they contend that the barbecuing of chickens in America is the moral equivalent of the cremating of Jews in the Holocaust. The equivalent.
Right. Let's take a moment to really appreciate just how utterly ill-informed and frankly moronic this segment from Dennis's master's program is. Seriously, I'm a vegetarian and the vast majority of my calories come from vegan products, and so I personally agree that there is a debate to be had about speciesism, and especially factory farming. But guess what? The vast majority of secularists don't share my view, and to anyone who understands what secularism is, so evidently not Dennis, this isn't surprising, since my views on animal welfare are not derived from the view that one shouldn't force others to live according to one's religious beliefs. Yeah, PETA can hardly be seen as a representative of the mainstream secular view of animal welfare, and to present their campaign as somehow representative of the wider secular population is significantly more absurd. Yes, more absurd than presenting the Westboro Baptist Church's campaign of picketing funerals as mainstream Christianity.
If you had just a little knowledge of the Bible, you would know that what you just said is stupidity.
We'd all recognise that it would be wrong to equate the average Christian with Fred Phelps, and yet, at least Christianity and the campaigns of the Westboro Baptist Church share the same substrate, namely the Bible.
You've got the duty to know the Bible as well as I do.
Hence, once again, Dennis has exposed himself as abysmally ill-informed or manipulative. I've recently invested all I have to turn Rationality Rules from a one-man band into a team, and so having a company that deals in investments invest in us in the form of a sponsorship is greatly appreciated. In an ideal scenario, even with the harsh realities of the economy, we'd all have money, and we'd be making our money work for us, freeing us so that we can focus our time on self-actualizing pursuits. But in 2023, that's easier said than done. Most ways of passively growing your money, like investing in the stock market, have been suffering this year. In fact, the Wall Street Journal reports the average portfolio of stocks and bonds that millions rely on lost a shocking 25% last year after inflation. But here's where Masterworks presents a fascinating opportunity. Masterworks is a unique platform that lets you invest in multi-million-dollar art by legends like Picasso and Banksy, but for a fraction of the full price. All Masterworks' offering circulars with the SEC are linked in the description, and at sec.gov. Like all investments, there's risk, But according to Citibank, this art has a very low correlation to other investment-like stocks, so when they dip, your art investments may not. In fact, even with all the economic chaos in 2023, Barron's reports art prices rose an average 29%, far outperforming stocks. What Masterworks is doing is pretty damn fascinating, and of course it's in their interest to get the highest possible return from selling their art. On this note, the last time I spoke about Masterworks in December, I mentioned that they had sold 2 paintings. Well, since then they've sold yet another 2 paintings, netting 35% and 10% respectively. This brings them to a total of 11 exits to date, all of them for a net return above 9%. So if you're looking to diversify your portfolio alongside 650,000 other clients of Masterworks, then be sure to click my link below.
I want a God who says, be good. You know the famous line from the Bible, love your neighbor as yourself? That's not the line. The line is, love your neighbor as yourself, I am God. If God doesn't say love your neighbor as yourself, it doesn't mean a damn thing. It's just a sweet suggestion.
Is it, though? Is it nothing more than a sweet suggestion, a vapid opinion to love your neighbour if God doesn't command it? There is a lot that can be said here. For instance, and as I'll expand upon in the next episode, we need to establish what it means to say that something is good simply because God says it's good. One worry is that if something is morally decent only if God says so, then it follows that if God commands genocide, as he did, see our last episode, then genocide would be morally right. In fact, on occasion, it would be a moral imperative. Hence, divine objective morality is nothing more than might makes right. And that's not morality, is it? But again, I'll address this in full next time. For now, let's explore what sociology and psychology has to say. Dennis won't, of course, much care for what experts have to say.
Believe me, if you went to college, you heard this.
But since most of us, pro-secular or anti-secular alike, do actually care what experts who have studied these nuanced and complex topics over a lifetime think, let's continue. What do social and evolutionary psychologists make of the claim that without God commanding us to love our neighbour, this is just a sweet suggestion?
If God doesn't say love your neighbor as yourself, it doesn't mean a damn thing.
Do they, like Dennis, think that without God, all moral claims are mere opinion, without foundation? No, they don't. As psychology professor Ara Narenzian explains in his book Big Gods, the building blocks of morality, such as intuitions, instincts, and emotions associated with kinship, reciprocity, and dominance hierarchies, predate religion, which gives us a pretty big hint that moral precepts are not arbitrary sweet suggestions. There's something more going on. Or as Christopher Hitchens put it, human decency is not derived from religion, it precedes it. As an example of what we could consider moral software, Ara looks at studies by Kylie Hamlin, Karen Wynn, and Paul Bloom, who have observed that moral-like judgments can be seen even in pre-verbal babies. By 6 months of age, they show a preference for an individual who helps and an aversion to an individual who obstructs someone else's goal. Hamlin and her colleagues further show the early precursor to another moral tendency that keeps the social order, punishing antisocial behaviour. 8-month-old babies not only prefer pro-social individuals, but they also prefer individuals who act harshly towards an antisocial individual. Another example of loving thy neighbour not being predicated on an unembodied mind's words is highlighted by Dr. Claire White in her book, An Introduction to the Cognitive Science of Religion. The philosopher Peter Singer points out a similarity in religious and non-religious dogma and philosophical writings, such as the notion of impartiality. This principle is found in many diverse religious and philosophical systems of morality. From the Golden Rule in Christianity, that is, do unto others as you would have done unto you, to the teachings of the renowned Chinese philosopher Confucius, and the political philosopher John Rawls's landmark theory of justice. Claire concludes that research converts on the idea that fully developed morality is ultimately a synthesis of the biological, cognitive, and cultural. Similar results have been found in studies about other primates. We humans are not unique. As the primatologist Franz de Waal has concluded, direct altruism, that is, altruism in response to another's pain, need, or distress, is phylogenetically ancient, probably as old as mammals and birds. But perhaps the most conclusive fact of all is that there are many common agreements between all societies, let alone religions, on justice. For instance, there is wide consensus on issues such as killing and torturing being morally wrong. But what's with this overlap? Where's it come from? Well, standing from our lofty, privileged 21st century standpoint with all the information available to us, this really isn't a difficult question to answer. As Charles Darwin wrote in The Descent of Man, when two tribes of primeval man living in the same country come into competition, if the one tribe included a great number of courageous, sympathetic and faithful members who were always ready to warn each other of danger, to aid and defend each other, which is to say they love their neighbour, this tribe would succeed better and conquer the other. Selfish and contentious people will not cohere, and without coherence nothing can be effected. A tribe rich in the above qualities would spread and be victorious over the other tribes. Indeed, even a basic understanding of evolution by natural selection provides a comprehensive explanation for our moral intuitions, and, by extension, our ethical frameworks. In fact, even before Darwin, there were some seriously impressive apes that still figured this out, such as my boy Percy Bysshe Shelley in 1814, 45 years before Darwin. It is manifest that if the eye could not see, nor the stomach digest, the human frame would not preserve its present mode of existence. It is equally certain, however, that the elements of its composition, if they did not exist in one form, must exist in another, and that the combination which they would form must, so long as they endured, derive support for their peculiar mode of being from their fitness of the circumstances of their situation. Hence, it's not surprising that social species exhibit moral frameworks that contain socially conducive precepts such as loving one's neighbour. Our moral intuition is no more arbitrary than is the light sensitivity of our pupils. As a social species, we come ready baked with social software. So when Dennis says,
If God doesn't say love your neighbor as yourself, it doesn't mean a damn thing. It's just a sweet suggestion.
He's simply wrong. Loving your neighbour isn't an arbitrary, whimsical, sweet suggestion predicated on thin air. To the contrary, it's hardwired into us, or at least most of us. What's more, as an explanation, evolution by natural selection is compatible with theism. It can be argued that God chose to imbue in us our moral apparatus through the process of evolution by natural selection. Yes, this doctrine comes with serious baggage, but at least it doesn't necessitate being scientifically illiterate. Now, I hear a few objections in the audience. Perhaps by a sweet suggestion, Dennis is expressing that without a God saying we must love our neighbours, it's not a universal objective fact that we should love our neighbours. Don't worry, I'm going to get to this. The point here, however, is to debunk the notion that without God prescribing moral rules, all rules don't mean a damn thing.
It doesn't mean a damn thing.
They do mean a damn thing. In essence, Dennis and his ilk often paint a black and white fallacy, where on the one hand we have divine command theory, and on the other, complete arbitrariness. What we've shown here is that this doesn't at all account for the landscape. Pretty much no one thinks that morality is completely and utterly made up without any foundation. And for Dennis to suggest that they do reveals that he either doesn't know what he's talking about, or he's being manipulative. Are you seeing a trend here?
What ensures a smaller government is when people believe that there is a God to whom they are accountable. Because if you're not accountable to God for your behavior, then you will have to be accountable to people for your behavior, to the state.
Yes, that's Dennis suggesting that secularism, the separation of religious institutions from state institutions, somehow ensures bigger governments compared to countries that force their religion into all aspects of public and private life through the government.
What ensures a smaller government is when people believe that there is a God.
And he says this with vague reference to recent protests in the United States.
If you really want to defund the police, I've got a method. Have everybody live by the 10 Commandments. Then you can defund the police.
Indeed, according to Dennis, if we could make people live by the 10 Commandments, we wouldn't need a big government. As far as he sees it, the reason secular countries need big governments is
because if you're not accountable to God for your behavior, then you will have to be accountable to people for your behavior, to the state.
There are at least 7 major issues with Dennis's claim that secularism ensures a bigger government. First, you're not just accountable to other people, the state, you're also accountable to you, yourself, your conscience. If you don't live according to your conscience, then you're gonna live in hell. When I, for example, don't eat meat, it's not because if I ate meat I'd be violating my state's rules. No, I'd be violating my conscience. Second, not only did Dennis fail to provide evidence for his claim that belief in God entails a smaller government, but if we take a look at the top countries on the Human Freedom Index, guess what? Secularism isn't the big controlling boogeyman that Dennis depicts. And this isn't a surprise. Secularism is the separation of religious institutions from state institutions, and so while Dennis's anti-secular state would seek to force, ironically via the police force, everyone else to abide by his religious beliefs, secularism definitionally won't do this. To the contrary, in fact, secularism encourages religious freedom. It ensures it. Third, the police are just one branch of what composes the government. There are many other departments, such as education, healthcare, and infrastructure. So even if religiosity reduced the need for a police force, and as just discussed, it doesn't, it in no way follows that religiosity entails a smaller government. This is just a non sequitur. Ironically, a religious state is going to need to be bigger, because while a secular state won't, for example, need to allocate resources into indoctrinating children in school, a religiously imbued state will. Fourth, the Ten Commandments don't nearly account for the societal issues of today. They don't tell us, for instance, how to house and benefit those with disabilities, how precisely to provide healthcare to our neighbours, nor how to create a fair society in which we all have an equal opportunity. You know, they don't inform us on how to value all humans. Fifth, a significant number of theists don't take the Ten Commandments literally. For instance, they happily depict God, heaven, hell, etc., as even Dennis has incessantly throughout his UberChad PhD program. Their work on Sunday, don't believe we're obligated to honour parents that are abusive, are fine with killing in self-defence, partake in adultery, and have ambition. Oh, and they certainly ain't down with stoning to death those who work on Sunday or cheat on their spouse. Sixth, and related to the fifth, we have the ever-present issue of interpretation. Weird, ain't it? An all-powerful, all-knowing and all-loving God has very clear rules that you must follow. In fact, if you break just one of these rules, he'll eternally forsake you. And yet he's chosen to communicate these crucial rules in a way that's pretty much impossible to accurately comprehend. Just as Dennis somehow interprets the Bible as to not condone slavery, others interpret that loving thy neighbour means having a decent welfare state. Seventh, and final for now, suppose Dennis got his rigid, outdated interpretation solidified. How is he going to force others to live up to his interpretation?
Have everybody live by the Ten Commandments.
Precisely. He'll need a very big police force, which will increase his big government as it shovels religious propaganda down the throats of children, as has been the case historically with all states in bed with religion. If you want, to scratch the surface, to force half the human race to give up much of their autonomy, just as Judaism, Christianity and Islam have and still do to females whenever they've got governmental power, or if you want to ensure that tons of people live unauthentically, just as all three of the aforementioned do when they hold the reins, then you're gonna need a big state. But to be sure to cover all angles here, it's more likely that when Dennis says,
have everybody live by the Ten Commandments,
he doesn't mean that we force others to live by the Ten Commandments, because in this hypothetical scenario that he's painted, each and every person themselves choose to live by the commandments. In this case though, all Dennis is saying is that if everyone thought the same and lived by the same rules, then we wouldn't need a big government. But again, even this isn't true, since a police force is only one element of what composes a government. Moreover, the observation that if everyone lived by the Ten Commandments we wouldn't need a big police force isn't exactly insightful, is it? In fact, in the context in which Dennis presents this trivial fact, it's a failure to understand the campaign and concerns of those who protest in the first place. If everyone lived by, say, Hindu scripture, we also wouldn't need a police force. Dennis throws out lofty controversial claims like this all throughout his alternative education, and I've opted to not comment on many of them. I've had to pick and choose my battles here. Still, I thought I'd give this one a response, since the narrative that the zealous opt for smaller governments is among the most ridiculous claims I've ever heard, and yet it's quite popular at the moment. Despite all his talk of freedom, Dennis won't be happy until he has his cake and makes you, through governmental oppression, eat it too. Dennis Prager is anti-freedom.
Because if you're not accountable to God for your behavior, then you will have to be accountable to people for your behavior, to the state.
For Dennis, being accountable to society spells catastrophe, and he's expressed this multiple times for decades. For instance, he emphasized this even more directly in his series of videos on the PragerU website about the Ten Commandments.
The recipe for a good world is all there in these 10 sublime commandments. But there is a catch. The 10 Commandments are predicated on the belief that they were given by an authority higher than any man, any king, or any government. That's why the sentence preceding the 10 Commandments asserts the following: God spoke all these words. You see, if the 10 Commandments, as great as they are, were given by any human authority, then any person could say, "Who is this man Moses? Who is this king or queen? Who is this government to tell me how I should behave?"
Now, luckily, we can turn again to the evidence of psychological studies to counter the belief that God's word is somehow essential in creating a sense of morality. Aaron Lorenzian has coined the phrase that secular societies climbed the ladder of religion and then kicked it away, by which he means that although religion played an important role in the initial construct of group identity in society, today secular institutions combined with strong economies have meant that the group-binding role played previously by religion is now played by other institutions. In Japan, for instance, Shinto and Buddhism are the religious ladders that they've climbed. In the past, these religions provided the Japanese with their epistemology, a theory of knowledge, ontology, the way the world is, morality, the way we ought to act, and even their aesthetics, what constitutes beauty. But as we've learned more about the universe, all of these steps of the ladder have been either replaced or modified. The same is true of the Anglosphere when it comes to specifically Christianity. Dennis and American conservatives in general are very fond of saying Judeo-Christian instead of Christian, but this is all narrative control. The term Judeo-Christian didn't appear until the 19th century, and for the vast majority of history, Christians have not got on too well with Dennis's kind.
That's not exactly what we call
convenient. Where once Christianity provided the Anglosphere its epistemology, ontology, morality, and aesthetics, we've replaced or modified each step. As an example of the religious ladder being kicked, Ara looks at Scandinavian societies, which are some of the least religious in the world, but where trust in the secular institutions is very high. He states, "In priming experiments, Azim Sharif and I have found that subtle exposure to words such as police and judge increased generosity between strangers as much as God-related words did. The same secular notions ruptured the mental connection between religion and morality." Professor Azim Sharif himself explains the importance of these findings in his edX course on the science of religion.
Is religion necessary to encourage cooperation at the levels that we now see? Now here, the answer is a clear no. There are many routes to cooperation, and there have been many mechanisms that have been identified by psychology that encourage moral behavior. Now, this helps explain why some of the most harmonious and functional countries on the planet happen to be some of the least religious. How have these countries managed to get there? Well, one strong explanation is that cooperation is achieved through a trusted set of secular institutions that let the rule of law be the deterrent rather than the fear of God.
Azim concludes by stating,
and indeed, if you look across countries, the strength of the rule of law is one of the strongest negative predictors of the importance of religion. All of this is to suggest that the places with high rates of atheism can still be remarkably cooperative. The atheists just respond to different deterrents.
Finally, in Professor Phil Zuckerman's book, Society Without God, he looked at the secular Scandinavian countries and concluded the following. It is a great socio-religious irony, for lack of a better term, that when we consider the fundamental values and moral imperatives contained within the world's great religions, such as caring for the sick, the infirm, the elderly, the poor, the orphaned, the vulnerable, practicing mercy, charity, and goodwill towards one's fellow human beings, and fostering generosity, humility, honesty, and communal concern over individual egotism. These traditional religious values are most successfully established, institutionalized, and put into practice at the societal level in the most irreligious nations in the world. Hence, perhaps there's a really simple explanation for why Dennis despises experts and academia. It's because the evidence contradicts his biases and narrative. He preaches the value of freedom, fighting against those who would tightly confine your thoughts, all while promoting the most suffocating ideas to have ever wasted our time. Throughout this episode, we focused on the sociological elements of morality. Dennis speaks as though our notions of good and bad are predicated on specifically belief in God, and even more specifically, belief that his God has said that certain things are good or bad.
If God doesn't say love your neighbor as yourself, it doesn't mean a damn thing.
But the evidence against Dennis is overwhelming. Religion, let alone Dennis's theism, is not necessary to foster moral behaviour and cooperation, as is ironically evidenced by the success of many of the most secular countries in the world. And again, this isn't a surprise. Freedom encourages innovation, and secularism is about freedom, namely religious freedom. In an interview in 1959, Bertrand Russell was asked what advice he'd give to future generations, and here's what he dispensed in relation to social cohesion and morality.
The moral thing I should wish to say to them is very simple. I should say, love is wise, hatred is foolish. In this world, which is getting more and more closely interconnected, we have to learn to tolerate each other. We have to learn to put up with the fact that some people say things that we don't like. We can only live together in that way. And if we are to live together and not die together, we must learn a kind of charity and a kind of tolerance, which is absolutely vital to the continuation of human life on this planet.
That, my fellow apes, is why secularism is paramount. Anyhow, we've got 2 more episodes yet to come in this series. The first is on metaethics, where we can really delve into the philosophy of morality, and the second is on wisdom.
No Bible, pretty much no wisdom. That's the way it works.
And, we're very tempted to make a 7th episode, dedicated to Dennis's strawmanning of social justice, and especially transgenderism.
Men don't give birth. If men give birth, why do we only know this now? Why didn't all the scientists of history know that? Did we just discover that men give birth?
But we'll leave this one for patrons to vote on. Talking of which, due to the topics and claims we're discussing, we're often getting demonetized or even having our videos age restricted. We understand why, of course, but this nevertheless significantly reduces our ability to justify taking on certain topics. So if you're able and willing, please consider supporting us through Patreon, YouTube membership, or PayPal. We can't do this without you. Until next time, my fellow apes. Until next time.